All right, thank you everyone for joining us for our panel discussion today, which is one that I'm particularly excited about as we're going to lean heavily into the governance theme, considering that technical capabilities and throughputs and scale and architecture have really dominated the conversations in a lot of conferences such as this. And I think to build around and think about governance really is a key turning point that sticks out to me as we think about the evolution of this industry. And Declan, I think it's important that we recognize that governance really is becoming a big part of the institutional adoption conversation now.
Yeah, definitely. I think we have open source software today, and open source software has been great. It's part of the foundation for many amazing technology companies, but open source is not enough, right? We need neutral governance if we're to see these technologies adopted, because financial institutions or any enterprise, they're looking to take a decades-long bet. They don't want that technology being swept from underneath their feet, right? So you can almost think of it as like a building. Open source allows you to open a door and peek inside. You can inspect the code, you can fork it, you can modify it. But without neutral governance, then the house could just be completely demolished and taken away. So I think that's the real key thing. And again, it's not really an ideology. It's more like a procurement decision, right? It's just practical, good sense decision-making from, in particular, enterprises, but also any sort of entrepreneurs looking to build, decades-long business.
So, Rob, what's to be gained if you were to adopt this type of governance model?
I mean, it's awesome. It's weird for me to be, as a technologist, to be thinking and be excited about governance. Like, it just feels like it's a boring thing that should just be solved. But it is important. It is that I think that mix, it starts with thinking about what's the right open source model for the software, what's the right sort of license that backs it. And then it's so much more than that. It's the making sure, to what Declan was saying, that the foundation's right, that you can trust that this software is going to be around for decades and decades. And I think that's been the key for us. And we've seen in Besu, we've seen through the years that this has been the reason why large institutions have chosen Besu, even without deliberate marketing to say, go choose Besu as your client. They've gone for the fact that it's Apache 2 based, and then that it's hosted by the Linux Foundation through the LFDT. And so it's been great.
So let's talk about that a little bit more, Besu's role in institutional adoption and the role that open governance has played in the evolution of it.
Yeah, and so I think that getting that mix of input from those entities to be able to help drive some of their features on the roadmap has been really valuable. And then just that knowledge that it is sitting in that sort of governance framework has been really valuable for them, I believe, as well.
Yeah. And also the same with you as well, if you can explain the role.
Yeah, I think maybe just so on Besu, right? Like Besu is like the institutional Ethereum client. It runs like 15% of Ethereum mainnet today, but it runs something like 80–90% of all blocks on like enterprise blockchains, right? This is the institutional client. And I think the reason for that is because of the neutral governance, right? Every single client is open source. There's only one that's actually being adopted, right? Like any person in here, who works for a bank or a financial institution or financial market infrastructure company is probably using or has heard of Besu, right? And I think what we've been doing with Linea technology, which we've also now sort of donated or given to the Linux Foundation, is the same bet that was made with Besu on sort of layer 1, where we're seeing a lot of adoption with financial institutions. We're now making the same bet, but on a layer 2 as well.
Yeah, so, and that's the whole thing. It's a matter of getting the buy-in from those existing institutions and also being able to integrate this type of governance framework with what they already have existing, right? So getting that buy-in is going to be key to it. So the question is, can institutions trust this type of governance model behind the infrastructure?
And yes, we've been seeing that over the past 8 years, and that has worked out really well for Besu, and I guess the adoption of that, and then being able to see that it is being used and bringing value to those institutions as well.
Yeah, I think they absolutely can, because Linux Foundation is a well-known, trusted brand. Again, the whole purpose is it doesn't put these sort of the core software, even if it is open source, into one single control of a company, which again is about de-risking, and they basically are just de-risking their procurement. So I think we've seen that through the success of Besu and just overall the many different projects that are actually sitting with Linux Foundation and LFDT, that yes, they do trust this.
Rob, would you say that we've reached a point where governance quality matters just as much as the technical quality behind these projects?
Yes, I think that we're definitely again seeing that adoption of Besu, I think, is coming from that governance that is there, and that trust in governance is really important for us and been the thing that's been very successful for us. And I can see when we have the conversations with institutions about why Besu, or what are some of the decisions that you're making with this, it is that governance there. It's almost like that old adage that no one gets fired for choosing IBM. It's no one gets fired for choosing something that's hosted by the Linux Foundation, is kind of the spot that we're starting to see now.
Well, it's interesting, Declan, because you have impact of organizations within this ecosystem governing together. And I always find that interesting when you have competitors and colleagues come together and really, in the absence of traditional regulatory framework, come together and put a governance structure around this ecosystem. How does that work? What does it mean when you see competitors and ecosystems governing together?
Yeah, I think it all comes down to having a mindset of abundance, right? Everyone here, like, this industry is still very early, and the only reason you do governance or standards is to grow the pie. And obviously it's beneficial for everyone, even if there is overlapping customers, so you could consider them being competitors, for people to come together to define standards, to govern those as well, because ultimately people need to feel like they've got skin in the game, they're able to influence it. That's not just the builders, but also the people who are actually using the technology should also be involved in governance where appropriate. And I think that just gives everything when it comes to adoption of technology and open source technology, the sort of right ingredients to create like a community around it that is able to sort of lobby together, build the right solutions for customers, but also make sure things are done in a compliant way, they're done in a feasible way. And so I think governance needs to encompass all of those attributes if it's to be successful.
Rob, I would also argue that it is a component of scalability as well, right? I mean, that's going to be your competitive advantage if you are governing along with the industry.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it's interesting when you think about the scalability. It's the scalability of number of entities that are able to work with and use the software, I think, is where it starts to come in and starts to be really valuable. And then being able to think about, I guess you think about the interop and those sorts of aspects, which are again, really important. I think the governance and influence of that to help produce standards is another piece that fits into the pie as well.
Are there some barriers that are challenges, or what are the challenges that you're hearing from the industry as it relates to governance? How should the ecosystem be thinking about it as it evangelizes adoption?
So I think there's probably the two sides to it that sit in there. I think for the engineers or the developers of the software, I think there is a little bit of friction that comes in from being a part of some sort of governance around what they're doing. And I don't think it's a huge amount, and there's good value out of it, so it's worth doing, but that it is one of the friction points that's there of thinking about, okay, we can't just necessarily do everything the way that we want. We've got to think about those people that are working with the software and that are our partners in the governance. And then I think on the other side, it can sometimes be hard to think about different clients who might be competitors, how they work together in the governance sort of side of things as well, and being able to have these people they're just the users of the software, but they compete against each other when they're not using the software. How do they think about sort of working together and making sure that they're doing stuff in a way that doesn't break down any rules around what they're doing?
And Declan, my follow-on to that is, how do you maintain innovation velocity once stewardship really becomes part of the community?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's important for the maintainers, the contributors, to continue to innovate, because otherwise, obviously, the technology just becomes redundant. I think, how do you do that? I think it's not an easy answer. I think it's about those people who are sort of leading the projects. You usually have a sort of project lead. They need to actually gather, again, have good product practices, right? So go out and talk to customers, make sure they're talking to regulators, understand the requirements, and then in a sort of almost a decentralized way, which is obviously always a bit more difficult than a sort of single project just deciding what needs to be done, is actually then get that sort of rough consensus around this is going to be a good feature for the project, and then also integrate it into the processes. And I think that's where it's important to have good structure and organizations that are really well experienced, like Linux Foundation, when it comes to building open source software.
The interesting thing with things a little bit then is with the governance that's there, can also help give those better product practices, because you are talking to those people who are helping to govern the roadmap for the software. It gives that more broad sense of inputs into that process.
Yeah. I just want to talk about this concept of crops, right, which is the EF mandate. So censorship resistant, open source, private, and secure. there are some trade-offs there. There are some tensions with that acronym. How do you address that? How do you balance those principles?
Yeah, I think, yeah, you're right. There's trade-offs in there. And I think you have to understand that the technology can be used by different people for different use cases, and not everyone's going to want the same properties. So with, for example, just taking the Linea stack that we contributed to the LFDT, you can get all those things, right? It's open source, you can include privacy, it's secure, it can be censorship resistant as well. Now, does everyone who wants to apply that technology to their own business use case want all of those things? Maybe not, but at least they have the choice and flexibility, to use it how they see fit. I think in terms of the actual, governance and open source piece itself, like that obviously is very well mapped onto the CROPS mandate, right? Like it's open source obviously is a natural one. I think in terms of security as well, like you can see how having, an open system is going to increase the amount of eyes that you have on the code for you to make the system more secure. So we've seen this with our own technology where, if you have everything open, then people can actually go in, they can contribute, they can patch bugs. This has been happening across the industry now. So I think it is actually quite CROPS aligned from that perspective.
And what are your thoughts?
And then I think it's super interesting to think about how much of that CROPS mandate ties back to what the institutions have been caring about and wanting to see more and more, both on the mainnet and then on their private permission chains as well. Those ideas of privacy and security in particular have always been such the key blockers almost to adoption and widespread adoption of blockchain. So it's exciting to see that those elements that are important for institutions are coming across onto the mainnet and sort of broader Ethereum ecosystem as well.
But how is that technically being addressed, though, right? When you have privacy on chain and open source, from a technical perspective, how is that being addressed? That would be my first question if I was looking to adopt.
Yeah, so privacy is an interesting term because there's different flavors of it. But what we're seeing resonate with the market today, and you have different customers, but let's just take financial institutions. They're very happy to have a sort of blockchain, right, that they can control, and they can get verifiable privacy through things like zero-knowledge proofs and through better access control systems. The part that makes it interesting is actually they can still get interoperability. So they're using open source technology, but the way they're configuring the system is it's still, confidential is probably the better term. But then through technology like zero-knowledge proofs, they're able to interoperate and interact with counterparties without revealing sensitive information still.
And I want for you to follow up on this as well. But Rob, when we think about tokenization as an example and scaling up with this and having common standards and neutral governance and so forth, do we run the risk of basically digitizing fragmentation?
So definitely, I think that's there. I think that the push towards open standards, I think, is going to be a key part of it. And I think leaning into those governance sort of spots around how do we think about building out those standards in a way that works well, and then again meets those requirements of the entities that want to work with it. So it's almost like a governance piece that ties back into how do you create those standards and frameworks that you're going to use to build on and build on top of. And I think that's going to be a key part. And doing that with a key, like I'm an Ethereum maxi at heart, and want to see Ethereum everywhere, but also am conscious that it's probably not going to be the one chain to solve all the problems. And so I think that people will deploy to other chains as well. So it's thinking about those standards being done in a way that's interoperable and having it work across different chains is going to be really important. And I think, again, coming back to the LFDT, I think that they have that sort of community and forum for being able to help create those standards and those interop places that does it in a way that helps take into all the different, I guess, competitors at a chain level to be able to work together and have that fleshed out.
Yeah. I think it's a good point that Rob makes as it relates to not having a one-size-fits-all solution type of chain, right? Because you do have to think about redundancy and not running into, the whole ethos behind Web3 is to avoid what we've seen in Web2, where there's just a handful of owners that are, that powerful within the ecosystem. So you want to make sure that, you're not married to just one type of chain, but again, you also don't want to operate in silos or be fragmented. How are you thinking about that, Declan?
Yeah, so I think interoperability is one of the key sort of remaining pillars for crypto as an industry to solve, and blockchains. I think it's very likely that you're going to see constellation of blockchains, right? Because people want to have that flexibility, that control. They want to be able to leverage public blockchains like Ethereum and Solana, but they also want to be able to bring their assets on chain or their clients' assets on chain. but then they don't want to, keep within their own four walls, right? They want to get outside. So until recently, there's not been a real way for them to do that without trade-offs, right? If you want to interoperate, you have to leverage third parties. That can introduce latency risk, security risk, which we've seen a lot recently. You're just adding more intermediaries, basically. And it's only now possible, again, with zero-knowledge proofs, so you're able to have your cake and eat it, right? You're able to have your own local blockchain, bring your assets on-chain, bring your clients' assets on-chain, but then you're able to now talk to counterparties through verifiable privacy with zero-knowledge proofs, and all that needs is a sort of common shared layer in order to post the commitments and things. But that basically is a solution or technical architecture that is now starting to roll out. We've been doing a lot of work at Consensys to kind of help get this out into the public. Then you're going to be able to have interoperability atomically, so you get non-repudiation guarantees, which is very important for finance in particular. And so you'll be able to sort of do things, you can imagine use cases like cross-chain DVP, right, where you're trying to swap a security or something for some cash and access for a custodian. You can now do that using blockchain. And yeah, this wasn't possible literally like just a year ago. So these things are only unrolling now. It takes a little bit of time for people to onboard, but once they do, then we'll see the sort of true, I think, end game for what blockchain architecture looks like. And it's very much like the internet, right, where you've got your sort of local websites and use HTTPS to securely and privately interact with one another.
Yeah, it seems like security and privacy, certainly security, for sure, Rob, has become a critical part of the conversation because, in development, it was more of the technology that kind of was at the forefront. And now, the more that it scales, the more it expands, and you're working with DTCC and Consensys and Linea and so forth. These are established ecosystems. It has to be secure. To Declan's point, the vulnerabilities and some of those gaps have been exposed.
Yeah, that's right. And so I think the pieces of the ZK technologies that Declan's been talking about are the pieces to help bring that security and safety there from a technology standpoint. And then thinking about the pieces that start to be there around communication, around different organizations, how do we think about these standards and how do we think about the application of these pieces starts to be the governance kind of piece that ties it together and makes it so that there's that mix of great technology that we're building on, as well as the governance to help make it real and really being applied to the world.
What about challenges, Declan, with existing or institutional legacy infrastructure and the integration of all of this?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, a lot of, let's just take finance, right? So a lot of enterprise blockchains have been around for a number of years, back from sort of 2018, 2019. A lot of these companies are actually running Besu as well, local private instances. I would say the problem today is that they've gone through years of like diligence and compliance teams, procurement processes. Now they want to be able to take the next step, which is, talking, interoperating without having to re-platform, right? Because they don't have to go through another procurement process with another vendor who may not be around in, 3 to 5 years from now. So again, it's like, what am I going to choose? How do I basically upgrade my existing system with a foundation that I know is going to be around here in 10 years? And this is where like the neutral governance and open source software, not only being easy for their existing teams to upgrade to, which is what we've done with the Besu, where you can upgrade to a Linea Besu chain, which gives you the interoperability that I mentioned, and that will all be available. And it will also be hosted by Linux Foundation. So you know that this is going to be around for a very long time. And again, multiple teams have already started to look at contributing as well. So there's not a single source of dependency risk there.
I mean, Rob, also the challenges, and this isn't specific to the digital asset industry, but the pace at which technology is evolving, right? I mean, if you're still trying to figure out your tech stack from 2018, 2019, a lot's happened in between.
Yeah, and it's interesting thinking about the coupling to Ethereum sort of side of that. And so it's a network that it's still being supported. It's been running continuously up for more than 10 years. That's amazing. To think about that with the upgrades that have happened to Ethereum. The move from proof of work to proof of stake has just sort of seen those really big seismic changes have happened in this technology stack over that 10-year period, but it's still been continued to work and keeps on working. And I think that's a part of the thinking around, I guess, this kind of technology stack, the Besu sort of linear direction, is you start to see those pieces that are tied to that Ethereum mainnet being able to see how they're going to continue for that long period of time.
Right, so that's obvious next question, Declan, right? What's next? Do you continue to build on the underlying ethos? Is there is there a reason to reinvent the wheel at this point?
I think what's next is just continuing on the march, right? We've been on this journey for a long time of progressive decentralization. I think leveraging neutral governance is just another step on that journey. I think, maybe like when we look at the bigger picture, right, for all of this to work, there needs to be a common shared layer. And I always ask people, like, what is it you're actually looking for in terms of a common shared layer? And it's that sort of 100% availability and sort of finality guarantees, right, that non-repudiation. And that is what Ethereum offers. So I think we made this long-term bet about building on a platform like Ethereum or a network like Ethereum that is able to continue to offer properties that make everything else actually appealing to customers. So I think what's next is just continuing on that journey, educating, trying to onboard people, because if you look at the number of assets on chain today in terms of, broadly, it's a drop in the ocean compared to what is available to be tokenized and come on chain. I think everyone's sort of sold now on the idea of tokenization, but there's still a long way to get there, not just through regulation, but also just through, there's all the nuances of actually being being a provider to go into a company and get their internal systems connected to these blockchains. All this stuff is still very, very complex.
Yeah, I think that's a great point that Declan makes, Robin. You and I were talking about this behind the scenes in terms of it's no longer us versus them. It's more of a progression of this integration and really thinking about user experience and kind of removing that ethos of it's either one or the other. Because I think it's firmly established at this point that it's going to be more of an integration.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's all about the working together and how do you make sure that we're helping to bring around this change that the technology can bring, and how do we do that as a group and work well together to do it. And even things like the crops mandate, how do we work together to actually realize the ideals and things that are happening in that sort of mandate.
So how does that work as it relates to the mandate and you're thinking about a neutral governance structure? Does someone introduce an idea? How is this voted on that this is the right next step to take? What does that look like in practice?
So I think, I guess on the Ethereum side that we see, it's people bring in the proposals and then people work it out and start to I guess deliver the working software to be there. And it starts to be very similar on the Besu sort of side of things, that it's very much about bringing forward these proposals. The core developers of Besu can review, can understand how this might fit into the roadmap, but it starts to be the shipping working code is kind of that at the end of the day where the mandate starts to come out and be realized. I
mean, this might sound a little bit elementary, but are people largely in agreement? Or where would the tension be?
Yeah, well, it all comes down to rough consensus, right? And there is a lot of tension in these processes, whether it's Ethereum or whether it's even just any sort of coordination mechanism, because you've always, and actually it's good to have tension because that means that you've got competing ideas and people are thinking about it. If everyone just hums along to the same ideas, you've probably got too much. People aren't actually willing to sort of share their opinions, which isn't good for the product, isn't good for the customer. So I think ultimately, it is doable.
Could you give us a high-level overview of some discussions that are taking place now in terms of the next steps for governance?
Yeah.
Either one of you.
I think for governance, I think it comes down to one of your earlier questions. Is how do we still onboard a lot of projects and ideas whilst keeping the velocity? What I'm actually seeing now is that loads of companies, projects, developers are looking to contribute projects to these neutral foundations, whether it's the LFDT, whether it's the EF, whether it's just all of these other sort of institutions that are popping up. And the problem there is it actually comes down to how quickly can you review them, or how can you make sure there's a community that's gathered around it that's going to continue to maintain and contribute. So you do have to some extent be a little bit selective, and I think the next step is about trying to make sure you get enough significant projects, that are looked over in the right sort of frameworks, but not overloading it too much so you get fragmentation of contributions and attention.
Yeah, Rob?
And I think it's also then helping to ensure that the best products and projects that are open source are brought into the governance sort of frameworks. So there's a bunch of organizations that are talking to the Linux Foundation in particular around their software and helping them move and take the step from saying it's ours to let's bring it out into the open and get that open source software that was ours out into the open and being governed well.
Which is interesting because we kicked this off with the question essentially, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Is it about the technology? Is it about the governance? And I think that really shows the maturation that is taking place in this space that governance, security, privacy is, it's a forethought. It's not something that is an afterthought. So in the last couple of minutes here, Rob, and then Declan, if you could follow up, any final thoughts that we need to walk away from or with?
So I think that governance is really essential to the long-term success and adoption of software by institutions. I think that it really is a key foundation to what Declan was saying at the beginning. And so I think we've seen that in Besu and seen that that is a real reality, that the adoption of Besu has been because of it being a part of the LFDT, and the mix of that, and I think the license have really been huge contributors to the adoption of this software. And so it is, what we're saying here is backed with the data to support it.
Yeah, I think when we look at where the world is going over the next few years, there is this sort of holy trinity, right? You have decentralized trust, which is blockchains. You have decentralized identity, which is, happening a lot more recently, and obviously decentralized AI. And I think we have to think about, these technologies are going to be so impactful for civilization. How do we make sure they're managed in a way that remains neutral when it comes to governance of these technologies?
I mean, that's a great point that you bring up, and I know AI inserts itself into every conversation, but now there's also trying to understand the role of how you're governing NHI, non-human identities, or agents, in that if you're working, with multiple blockchains, as an example, your governance structure could look a certain way for AI agents, and another one could have a different type of governance structure for the AI agents. I mean, is that something that keeps you up at night? Because, managing human identities is challenging enough. Now you have NHI thrown in there.
Well, it almost starts to resemble a little bit like civilization, right? Where you have like states or nations. You can almost sometimes think of blockchains as like nation states. And so agents, very similar to humans in like the physical world, may choose or may not be able to access certain ones depending on the principles, depending on like the gatekeeping. So I think you start to see this world of like machine to machine happening on blockchain the same way we see as human to human interaction happening in the physical world today.
Yeah, and I think like when we start to think about that machine to machine, I think there's a huge place for blockchain to sit in there for helping to manage those identities, helping to have registries. There's the 8004 sort of ERC sort of standard to help sort of do some of that work. But I think that's going to be a really key part of that infrastructure to help make that all work.
All right, we will end it on a positive note. Thank you both for your contributions, and thanks for having us here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.